All right, thank you everybody for joining us. I'm going to get started, though we might have some people joining in the next couple of minutes. Welcome to the Minnesota Learning Commons monthly Best of the Summit webinar. Today we are hearing from Elizabeth Harsma on Are We Doing Enough to Help Faculty Teach Online? If you enjoyed today's presentation, you can be sure to join us next month, February 20th at the same time, 3 p.m. Central, for Scrum for Educators, How We Get Things Done, Accomplish More, and Stress Less, presented by Ben Drullo and Mike Smart. And with that, I am going to hand things over to our presenter, Elizabeth Harsma. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. I do want to just put in an extra plug for next month's webinar. I did attend a longer session with these folks, and they have some great information to share. So if you love learning about organization and want to be more efficient with your time, I would really recommend attending next month's webinar as well. But coming back to right now, thank you for being here and taking time out of your busy schedule to join this conversation. So this presentation was originally a roundtable discussion, and just as soon as Suzanne stops sharing her screen, we'll switch over and I'll share my screen and we'll get rocking here with that presentation. And what this original presentation was designed as a roundtable. So we're going to be having some discussions. So the question that was posed was, are we doing enough for faculty who are teaching online? Many of us are probably in support roles, helping train faculty, provide professional development, maybe even doing some course design or development on behalf of faculty or as partners. So these are all things that, so this is the core of what we want to discuss today and share across Minnesota, our expertise in these areas, whether you're a faculty member or in a support role or an administrator or whatever it might be, maybe a student, we all have insights and knowledge to share, and that's what the purpose of this whole session was. So what I want to start with is just a little bit of introductions. So if you would go ahead and add into the chat here some of your introductions. I'd love to get to know a little bit of who is joining us today. So if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, go ahead and take a minute to do it now and we can get to know you a little bit better. And in the meantime, I'll introduce myself. So the invitation is in that chat feature to introduce one more time yourself, what institution you work at, and what your role is, and what your experience is with online learning and online teaching. So if you'd like to do that now, feel free to go ahead. Who I am is, well, I'm Elizabeth Harsma, as Suzanne mentioned, and I'm an instructional designer and technologist at Minnesota State Mankato. And really, when it comes down to it, what I do here is to support student success through faculty development in a lot of different ways, particularly through technology support and also through effective learning design in online and technology-driven spaces. And I'm sure many of you have similar sort of experiences and backgrounds to share. So. Great, I see some professors, I see some technologists here in the group. Great to have you all, some instructional designers. Great, I see some librarians, administrators as well. Welcome, thank you all for joining this really important and timely conversation. So the reason this question came to my mind originally was that I happened to cross this article back in February of 2019. And the headline, of course, caught my eye because I am directly responsible for helping people teach online in a lot of ways. And so when I saw too little help, I thought, well, what is that about? So I read this article that took a look at, it was really a summary of a survey report. And you can go, I'll include a link to that original article in our chat here at the end of our session. But that report essentially was a survey of provosts of public higher education institutions. And they were looking at what kinds of support and training and professional development was going on for faculty who are teaching online. And the conclusion, or one of the conclusions of the report, was that faculty are not being given or not having the opportunity to get the support they need to be effective in an online environment and also to continue to develop their skills. And the report also included 4 general recommendations. And these were the recommendations: mandatory or incentivized training for instructors, a regular feedback cycle for continuous professional development, a regular feedback cycle for evaluation, including peer feedback, and uniform learning experiences for standing components of an online course. So as someone who is in a technologist role and not an administrator role, I began to think, what kinds of things are we already doing in alignment with these recommendations? What sorts of changes could we make? And are they really feasible in our institution? And those are the kinds of questions that I wanted to pose to other folks all over the state, learn what they're doing, learn from their expertise, their experiences. So that's the purpose of this outcome in this session today. I'm hoping we'll have some really great, robust conversations. So the outcomes here are to evaluate these recommendations, to assess what level of culture change, or is there a necessity for culture change to implement some or all of these recommendations, and to use our own expertise to apply this for hypothesizing into future, for sharing programming models and different practices into those recommendations. So those are the things we're going to do today in a sort of a structured group process. So I'm going to talk about these group process steps. We're doing a modified version from the roundtable, which was a face-to-face session. So these are the 4 steps, and I'm going to review these 4 steps for group process before we get started on our conversation. So the first one, and this should feel familiar for many educators, the first step is thinking. This is a silent processing moment. I'm going to present everyone with a set of questions, and we'll all take 3 minutes or so to think about those, take some notes, maybe share some thoughts in the chat. Then our step 2 will be our share. So because we don't have a breakout functionality in this particular webinar configuration, we're going to do our best to manage it with a fairly large group, 36 participants or so, via chat or chiming in one at a time via audio here. And all of you should have the ability to unmute your microphone and share. So we'll do our best to go around and give everyone a chance to share some responses to those questions, either via chat or audio. And then our step 3 is going to be when we actually start our discussion. So maybe someone mentions something that lights a question in your mind, or they give an example and you'd like some more details about the example they gave. This is our opportunity then in step 3 to really dig into those questions. So be sure you have something you can take notes on if that's how you like to remember things, or whatever you need to remember for that discussion round. And then the step 4 of ours is going to be just a quick share of our takeaways from those questions. So it'll be our top 3 takeaways from our conversation. It should be a bit of a whirlwind. In the round table, we did this in 2 rounds, 2-3 rounds. In this session, we're going to do it all at once. So feel free now, just as a quick review, we'll do a first step in our discussion, which is thinking about things silently, answering the questions on our own. The second round, we'll share our responses either in chat or audio. Third round, then we'll discuss everything as a group, ask some questions, and then we'll do our takeaway at the end here. So these are the questions. We've come to the questions. So don't feel like you have to answer all of these questions, or that you have to answer every single point to these questions. These are to help generate some thoughts and things to think about in alignment with these recommendations. So to kick things off, we're going to start with our first step, which is thinking. So I'm going to invite everyone for about 3 minutes to think about the questions that are posed here on your screen. 3 different areas: evaluate, assess, and apply. And so thinking about those recommendations, the mandatory or incentivized training, the regular feedback cycles for professional development and evaluation, and the uniform learning experience for online courses, here are the questions to think about. What are you or your institution currently doing in these areas? Are these recommendations appropriate for your institution? Why or why not? What's missing? What should be thrown out? The assess area: how do you or your institution motivate or incentivize this development? What kinds of efforts have you done for building a culture of professional development? What changes are needed? And what are the components or process of that culture change? And then application: what's on the horizon for faculty development in this area? What are the plans for getting there? And what are some of those best practices we can all share to help establish and maintain robust faculty development in online teaching and learning? So lots of big questions. I'm going to mute my microphone, give everyone 3 minutes to silently process these questions, take some notes, and then we're going to jump back in with our share round, where we can either share in the chat or we can unmute one at a time and share our responses via audio. So I'm going to mute my microphone. I'll be back in 3 minutes while we're all sort of processing and thinking about questions. All right, it has been about 3 minutes, so we're going to get ready to go into our share round. We have a couple of recommendations or reminders. First thing is that this webinar is being recorded, so we just want everyone to let everyone know that this will be recorded and put on YouTube after the fact. So as we move into the share round, we want everyone to be aware of that. This is a recorded session and will be shared publicly. And then the second thing is that if you are using the chat feature, remember to set your message to send to all panelists and attendees. That makes sure that everyone in the session can view your message. Panelists will just go to me and Suzanne. And if you want your other peers or colleagues in the group to see your message, go ahead and change that setting in your chat feature. So with that being said, we are ready to move into our share round to answer all of these questions that we've reflected on in terms of the Learning House recommendations. So I'd like to stop sharing my screen now and open the floor to sharing. Great, Dan, thanks for that question. The Learning House is the company that conducted the survey and compiled the report. It's now owned by Wiley Publisher. I can grab that link and I'll share it in the chat for everyone. That goes directly to the report. So both the report and the summary article. So. Great, so I see some folks sharing. Someone writes, at Hamlin, we have an online learning community that meets throughout the year to discuss Quality Matters standards and general online teaching best practices, and all in faculty are invited. Excuse me, correction, all faculty who are teaching online are invited to join. So. This is a great comment. A lot of teachers feel like they're on an island. This can be compounded for online classes. I know I've felt that as an online teacher myself. I think a lot of development could be shared, be around shared experiences with student involvement. That's a great comment. There's actually, I can't remember the particular research article, but there was an interesting qualitative study done on faculty development in online teaching and learning. And one of the ways they found faculty were most engaged is if you can address why something leads to student success. So something like interacting with students actually improves or increases chances of student success, but also it can help faculty feel more connected in their online environment, right? Yeah. More connection and support. I think that seems like a common theme that's coming through. I see some other comments. Another comment, training for instructors and developing uniform standards for online components is important. So I see the challenge is who is the responsible party for the consistent design and building? That's a big question. Maybe someone in the roundtable or someone here today has a good model for that. I'd love to hear some of their models. Great, I see some institutions have a coaching and mentoring model, a pretty robust initiative. I'd like to hear more about that. Here's some comments about when faculty are new to online, they're nervous about working within the LMS, but want to become more self-sufficient. I think that's a great point. Being comfortable with the technology itself can be an important step in online teaching and learning. I see some folks commenting about training not being mandatory. Yeah, I see some comments about professional development and the mandatory professional development that can actually work against maybe ultimately the goals that we're working towards. Mm-hmm. Yes, the ever challenge of many demands and few resources in terms of time and funding. That's always a question I have in my mind. Faculty are pulled in many different directions. Great, I see some folks saying they host some sessions on a monthly basis. We have some questions about frequency of training. All of you are also welcome to unmute and share via audio. I don't have to be the only one talking here, but I'm happy to report out in an audio capacity as well as a text capacity. Great, I see some great comments about and questions about adjuncts teaching online courses and that particular subset of faculty. I see some one-to-one mentoring models that are mentioned here. Sharing some training. So we'll maybe take a few more minutes just sharing responses to some of those questions. I can bring up those questions again for those of you who need a refresh. And I see some other comments about full-time faculty and adjuncts. Most faculty who participate in mentoring are full-time, and also adjuncts are more likely to ask other faculty for support. So this particular survey did identify they said that about 30% of online courses were taught by adjuncts per the provost reporting in this particular survey. Great, we have some professional development committees who also work in this area. I see some folks do. That's a great question. I think that's come up here. How are folks defining an online course? right? Because most institutions now do use a learning management system, even if the class is a quote face-to-face class. That's a really good question. The survey itself defined online in different capacities. I think they broke it out in more detail in terms of different types of online. You could read the full report if you wanted to have more breakdown and detail on that. In terms of institution, I think it does depend. That might be an interesting question to pose for the group discussion. So what does online mean at your institution versus a blended course versus a face-to-face course, right? Most courses now have some sort of technological or virtual environment they're using, right? Mm-hmm. So someone's commenting about mandatory training and how that probably wouldn't be possible at their particular institution. Yes, those are some of the questions I have as well in terms of mandatory training. I would anticipate some pushback from faculty, particularly, and also from administration. The cost of having mandatory training could be prohibitive for some institutions, right? Okay, that's an interesting comment. It seems that some institutions training is also not a good term, sure. Professional development perhaps would be a better term at some institutions. Mm-hmm.
Which is frustrating because there's a big development between training and professional development, but calling it what it is seen by some faculty members as beneath them, is what we were taught at the Educause Institute.
Oh, interesting. Thank you for sharing that. That might be an interesting topic of discussion as well as we move into sort of more of our discussion round. Mm-hmm. Oh, this is a great point. I see someone else commenting, should everyone do the same professional development? Does it always have to be internal to the institution? Would it be better to have people select their own professional development? Those are great questions. Oh, this is a really interesting topic as well. In K-12, perhaps online professional development or online teaching professional development could be part of their license renewal. That's an interesting thought too. I wonder if there's a credentialing process that also could be related or tied to professional development in some way at some institutions. Okay, I see some institutions are finding a one-to-one consult model is maybe being more viable as well, or a more engaged approach. Sure. Gotcha. Yeah, faculty engagement in professional development is probably we could spend a lot of time talking on that. Yes, that one of the challenges I think is resources. These recommendations are wonderful, but if the model is one-to-one, right, and you only have a certain number of staff dedicated to online support, you have a limited capacity, right, for providing that kind of support. Yep. I see some other folks sort of resonating with engagement in larger group sessions versus one-on-one. We're going to wrap up our sharing in just a couple more minutes, and then maybe we'll open it up to some discussion questions, some themes we could share or explore a little more in depth. I'd love to hear more about some of these one-on-one mentoring models. I think there'd be some other folks who might be interested to learn about those models. I'd be interested in hearing about any other programming that folks are doing in regards to online professional development, and anything people are doing in regards to culture change, which seems to be something maybe that the training versus professional development terminology maybe is touching on, or some of the pushback on having mandatory training versus an individualized learning path, and how to navigate those spaces. I'd love to hear more about some things that folks have explored or tried at their institutions. So let's go ahead and move into our discussion phase then. So I'd welcome anyone to unmute and share about what their institution is doing more in depth. We've gotten some sort of smaller comments, but me personally, I know a few people had mentioned some one-to-one mentoring models. I'd love to hear more in depth about that and how that plays out in your institution, what the model is, how are you engaging or communicating with faculty about those opportunities, what ways are you approaching those sessions. I'm not sure who is sharing about that, but I'd love to hear more about that if someone wanted to share. Okay, great. So I see someone sharing. They're trying to request 15 minutes at departmental meetings to introduce a professional development topic. That's one strategy that they're approaching, and then using a one-on-one follow-up model after that. Great. So I see some other folks doing one-on-one instructional design and technology supports. I see some folks mentioning about using in-service days, but that those are not necessarily well attended. Has anyone else had that experience? Anyone have great success with in-service days or group sessions that they've worked with? Retreat models, anyone have anything they want to share on?
Hi, this is Fritz from the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts. We, and this is a department did this, but we can only do that with our professional administrative instructors and faculty, not tenure and tenure track. The tenure track don't do in-service. So, but some departments are doing this with what we call P&A instructors now during breaks and other times when they're under contract but not teaching.
So do you want to explain what that in-service looks like, or just give us an example of that specific in-service you're providing to folks?
Sure. So recently we've done some workshops during the winter break for instructors who are going to be teaching a blended course in the fall. This is like 15 or more instructors. So a lot of them have never done that at all. So we've been having workshops. Well, they're not under a teaching load. The grading's done and all that. The semester hasn't started. So we've done some a couple in December, a couple of days this week, and then we're going to do some in May as well, and probably some more next summer. So just workshops talking about, you know, all the concepts of blended teaching, practice, playing in Canvas, all that kind of stuff. But our technology enhanced learning team, we didn't call those and prepare those. The program leader, who's a faculty member, said to the instructors that they're going to do that. We, the instructional designers and academic technologists, did not compel them to do that. We really can't compel anyone to do anything at the university. We just do it through relationships and charm.
Great, thank you for sharing that, Fritz. Yeah, I think I know I personally can relate to that sort of experience. In a support role, sometimes it can feel like I'm here to support you, and then to try to generate some momentum behind that and engage folks can be pretty challenging when there's no real leverage, right, on your end. You're simply there to provide the service. So, so it sounds like you've built some relationships and gotten some faculty partners who are behind this sort of professional development to help you along the way. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I mean, the head of this program, I mean, this is happening. This course is going to be taught in a blended fashion in the fall. So they, you know, the point has already been set on the horizon, so we have to get there. So, I mean, they have a reason to push their instructors to do this, this professional development, and the instructors, if they want to be, you know, if they want to continue to be teaching this program, they're, you know, they have a reason to do that as well, to take part in it. Everyone has an incentive in a way.
Sure. Thank you for sharing that particular model. Anyone else want to share some experiences with professional development, ways to engage faculty, a particular model that you're exploring now or looking towards into the future? I see some activity happening in the chat here. Some folks doing like some different office hour drop-ins. That maybe worked initially, but maybe faded a little bit, it sounds like. Let's see, some folks mentioning faculty learning design and online teaching competencies that are then mapped to professional development opportunities. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that exact maybe structure, but I'd be interested to hear about that as well. Looks like some folks had some good success with some breakout sessions during a professional development day. Looks like James maybe is mentioning that. I'd love to hear more about that, the kinds of topics that you offered, the structure of those sessions. So there's some interesting comments, I think, about culture change as well, and maybe building some administrative buy-in as well for the importance of these kinds of trainings. Any thoughts on that, or any movement on that that you could share would be great. So it looks like some folks are getting engagement at an administrative level. Great. Great, so it looks like, James, you did, was this a remote session? You're talking about having it on Kaltura Media Space? So it was it on captioning? It was on an accessibility topic or something else, it looks like, I'm not sure. If you want to chime in, I'd love to hear more. Thanks for sharing that link, Nancy. That could be a really good resource, I think, for some folks to do some mapping of their offerings to those competencies. Okay, great. So James offered some topics about making videos in media space and captioning them for educational purposes. And those seem to be a popular topic. Great, thank you for sharing that. So one of the recommendations from the Learning House is a feedback cycle for continual professional development. One of the questions in my mind is, how many of you folks have a method for ongoing review of online course design and delivery? If you do, I'd love for you to chime in and share about what that process is like. That's something that I'm interested in. It's not something that I have at my institution currently or that I'm aware of. It might be at a program or a department level, but there's no formal process for continuing to review and update online course offerings. it's sort of on an instructor basis, like many of you were mentioning. It's sort of on a one-on-one basis. That's maybe one of the things that I found was challenging about this particular survey, because I find a lot of the professional development is one-on-one and is pretty individualized. So how do you at an institutional level implement these kinds of recommendations? Okay, I see. Any thoughts, hypotheses, wild ideas? I'd love to hear them. That's sort of part of what the roundtable discussion was hopefully about, is to generate some new ideas, hopefully some new ways to think about it. Great. Okay, so it looks like Quality Matters has been a model for some online courses, but just a small percentage. We also do have Quality Matters here. That's, again, on a one-on-one basis, maybe similar to what you're saying, Jennifer. Yeah. Okay, so let's see, someone else is mentioning. Okay, so they were designed and now managed individually. At some point they were similar, but now over 2 years, they've maybe diverged a little bit from their consistent design. Looks like some folks are doing review at the dean's level if they choose to have their course observed. So that's sort of, again, just on a one-on-one basis. See some other folks, again, using the Quality Matters. So I see a faculty member, so ensuring academic freedom. So many faculty are not open to sharing their courses. That's another thought that came to my mind too, is how do you maintain uniform learning experiences with standard components while maintaining that academic freedom, which is absolutely important. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that. If you have ideas about ways to approach that, Lisa, that would be great to hear about. So it looks like just reviewing syllabus. So not the entire online course design. That does make it challenging. Great, I see some folks are doing a 1 hour QM review. So just a quick way to do a quick online course design checklist. Very pretty simple and maybe a bit more manageable. Entire QM review of a course can be pretty challenging or a bit intimidating for some folks. See some other folks chiming in. They use QM for course evaluation purposes loosely, maybe, but not necessarily in a formal or a procedural way. Great, so I see also some encouragement to use tools like Quality Matters and other course review sort of course design models, but nothing mandatory. Great, these are all good thoughts, good shares. So we'll spend a few more minutes just in our discussion time. Some of the other things that popped up when we were sharing is this coaching model and defining what an online course is. Do you provide professional development or coaching that's distinct for face-to-face and for online? And how do you distinguish between those? What do those things look like? I'd love to hear more about that. Oh, great, I see an idea. To draw faculty in is to point out that the more we have in common, the more, as we teach online, the more students we can attract. Great, so connecting some of these pieces to student success and also to student retention or recruitment, right, can be a great incentive for faculty. Thank you for sharing that, Lisa. Appreciate that. So great, I see someone sharing. Oh, hey, Stephen, I didn't know you were in here. Great to have you. Thanks for sharing about the quality improvement process. Yep, that's something that is working on system-wide. So each institution can have some processes for working with online course design and delivery quality. Yeah, great, thank you for mentioning that. So there were some questions about adjunct faculty and helping adjunct faculty, maybe even teaching assistants get prepared. So I see someone shared that they've developed a generic template for online courses to share. And for some programs, they all decide to use the template. And for some programs, it's more of a suggestion. So great. So having a template course for an online course design is maybe an approach as well. But again, sort of engagement is maybe the other issue. The other question I had, just to kind of maybe a final discussion thought maybe for everyone, ideas or thoughts about nudging culture change. Of course, in an institution, we can't make drastic changes quickly, but we can maybe nudge the culture of professional development towards valuing and finding this kind of professional development really important. Lisa had suggested connecting things to student success and retention and recruitment maybe. What are some of these other thoughts about sort of nudging culture in an institution to value this kind of professional development? Any thoughts about that? I see some other questions going on in the chat as well. But culture change, ways to nudge that forward. Let's see, I see a comment from Joseph, thank you. When the faculty want professional development, but then don't attend because it's not compensated. Oh, this is another question. Aha, how do you get faculty to attend when they're not attending due to lack of compensation or no monetary incentivization? Any folks on here who are paying faculty for professional development? I see another suggestion, nudge culture change forward, make your dean communicate it. Okay, so building some relationships with administration and some of those key players around campus that can really engage with faculty on an important level, that's a good suggestion. I think even in a support role as an instructional designer, I can work with maybe my ACIO or CIO with some of these things and say, hey, our team really finds these things valuable. Do you think you could communicate that or work with you know, our administration or some of our leadership councils to begin to kind of nudge that change forward? I see some other things. Let's see. Joseph, absolutely, faculty can be very overwhelmed. That's something that I also comes to mind here. Faculty are often not provided a context in which they can value these things, if that makes sense. And that's one of the challenges that I've found with implementing these kinds of recommendations, especially when we don't want to use the mandatory word or we don't have the funds to pay faculty, which actually I can't quote the research, but I think paying faculty to do professional development it maybe doesn't necessarily incentivize them or build that additional engagement after a certain point. So it might not be the best model. That was maybe some of the pushback I had on these recommendations as well. So I think it's more of an intrinsic motivation thing that needs to happen. So I see Dakota addressing some personal hurdles with faculty rather than random new ideas. Great, that's a really good point, right? Yeah, that faculty want to see the value in what they're doing and how it's addressing their immediate needs. So it's actually a really great connection to some adult learning theory. Adult learners want to know what they need to know to accomplish the work in front of them, right? Rather than sort of like, here's some great new ideas when maybe they don't have the time to focus on those fun things, even though they're maybe exciting and potentially cool. So great, I see Lisa commenting about thinking about some influencers in social media, thinking about influencers on campus. That's a great idea. Thank you for sharing that, Lisa. Yeah, these are all great comments. So building some relationships with some influencers on campus, sort of in a more intentional way maybe, because we all know that there's sort of those early adopters and champions on our campuses, but thinking about using the influencers model in a more strategic or structured way could be a really interesting approach to building faculty engagement. Yeah. Oh, great. So here's another idea kind of chiming in on that. Influencer, putting on a live class conducted by an influencer for face-to-face professional development. Great, try it out, Dakota, and report back. I'd love to hear more about how that went. I'm kind of interested in exploring that idea as well. That kind of sparked a little excitement in the back of my brain here. So I'll have to brainstorm a little bit on that idea of using an influencer model, but also respecting that early adopters and champions tend to get utilized a lot in this capacity, right? So trying to balance the time and the energy that person is putting into that work already, by not asking too much of them or putting too many additional demands. That's something that comes to mind immediately. Yeah. Great, and I see another Heather chiming in as well, that they've tried to have faculty that are using tools present with your online learning office to share their experiences to build credibility and influence. That's great, thank you. Thank you for that comment, Heather. Did you find you had a lot of success, Heather, with that? Do you think that did help build some credibility and influence? Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments as we're kind of wrapping up our final discussion here? I want to leave some time for some takeaways. Heather, it improved in attendance. Oh, great. That's great to hear. Thank you for sharing that. So Heather reported that having an influencer model, giving a session and giving some credibility did help improve attendance. I see James choosing professional development topics that are focused and specific, rather than generic things. Great, that's a great suggestion. Thank you for that suggestion, James. I know micro-learning is sort of a bigger trend right now, especially in sort of workplace training environments. That could be something to explore as well. Micro-learning is very focused and very specific, right? It's a very short learning module on a very specific topic. Yeah, Jennifer, do you have some thoughts to share or experiences or knowledge you have about microlearning? I'm just sort of diving into that. So I'd love to hear if anyone else has some additional thoughts to share as we wrap up just this last minute or so of our discussion. Okay, so Jennifer says, haven't tried anything, looking into it. Great, you'll have to try it out and report back. We'll want to hear more about it. Awesome, well, I think what we'll do is we'll wrap up sort of our discussion section and we'll jump into just some final takeaways. I know this has been a pretty quick discussion, and with this particular technology, we don't necessarily have the same kind of discussion experience, but I'd love to hear any 1 to 3 final takeaways or tidbits that you might continue to dive into or investigate after this session. So any big takeaways from our discussion today? You can throw them down in the chat, or I'd love, if you wanted to, feel free to unmute and share your takeaway with us via audio. Great, Dakota. So had a takeaway that they're not alone with having engagement and attendance issues, and other folks are also using one-to-one model. Thank you for that share, Dakota. Anyone else want to share? So I see a suggestion. One ingredient is how to get faculty to attend and use their professional development time. Yes. So it's really more of the how. I think we probably as support staff all have the what, right? And the content and the information they need, but a lot of it is how to engage. Yeah, thank you for that share, Chris. Any other takeaways that we want to share in our last few minutes? the idea of the mini reviews. So something that's chunked together in sort of concept or knowledge chunks might be more manageable for folks. Lisa would like to learn more about micro-learning. Any suggestions for resources? I'd love to learn that too. So if anyone wants to throw down some micro-learning resources in the chat, that would be a great, I would love to share with that as well. All right, any final thoughts or takeaways? I want to be mindful of all of our time today and conclude our session on time. So I see a few more takeaways. Let's see, using professional development times for departments to get together and just talk and share what they're doing. Oh, great idea to use Teams to recreate that kind of sharing experience online between faculty. Great, I see someone, they're gonna be reading and reflecting on those online teaching competencies that one of our attendees shared. Great, thank you for those takeaways. All right, well, again, I wanna be mindful of our time and I wanna wrap up just before 4 o'clock. So thank you everyone so much for being here, for sharing, and for being a part of improving online education for everyone. So much appreciated, everyone. Thank you so much.
All right, very lively discussion this month. Thank you everyone for joining us. Once again, if you enjoyed today's session, please do join us next month where we will be talking about Scrum for educators, how we get things done, accomplish more, and stress less.